Last week on Crash Course, we talked about World War II. The time period after World War II was a time of new ideas of how to better prevent global conflicts from arising in the future. What major problems arose at the end of World War II? How did the Allied victors attempt to solve them? How were borders redrawn? I'm Ren McLean, and this is Crash Course World History. So the US, no longer following their isolationist policy of early World War II, emerged as a superpower in international relations and European politics, taking Britain's place as the peacekeepers of the world. The US's role in key decision-making constantly put them at odds with the Soviet Union, as the two nations were no longer united by their fear of Germany. They fought bitterly over their dominance in new nations that arose after the fall of Germany and Japan's empires, and over their influence in nations torn between democracy and communism. The uncertainty and instability of post-World War II led directly to political stalemate known as the Cold War, which was the culmination of failed US and USSR policies and the contrasting ideologies of democracy and communism. Despite the complicated politics at play during the Cold War, all of the countries had a common goal: to gain national security and economic recovery. In the quest for national security, many nations frantically began to claim more land. This method of expansion for national security was mainly seen with the USSR and Western Europe. With no other strong countries remaining in Europe to stop them, the USSR began to rapidly expand. Stalin's goal was to create a buffer of communist states between the USSR and Western Europe. This was for security reasons, as the USSR had been attacked through Poland 3 times since 1812, and political reasons. He wished to block the radical Western thought from entering the USSR. With no resistance from the Western European powers as they were still attempting to recover from the devastation from World War II, it fell to the US to attempt to stall the expansion of communism. However, instead of opposing the USSR with military strength, the United States and the USSR began a series of complex land negotiations during post-World War II Allied conferences. The issue about the division of lands, especially Germany, was discussed at a series of conferences between the major world powers. These conferences were located in places such as Moscow, Tehran, Bretton Woods, Dumbarton Oaks, Yalta, and Potsdam. By the end of these conferences, the world powers had agreed that a second front was needed for the USSR as a buffer between them and Germany, on establishing a World Bank and International Monetary Fund, on creating the United Nations organization, and that Germany should be divided in some way. However, many problems arose from these conferences, as different nations had different ideas on what should be done and whose interests should be served. The most tense topics discussed included where exactly to divide Germany and Japan, reparation payments, especially for Germany, the types of governments that should be established in Eastern Europe, especially for Poland, trade and monetary policies, and the specifics of the United Nations. Altogether, these issues showed the problems and inefficiency in how the world was split, creating increasingly strained relations that arose because of the decisions made. The Potsdam Conference was a conference involving leaders of the major Allied powers. Powers including Stalin and Truman met in August of 1945. However, the Soviet Union was left out of discussions because they had not yet declared war on Japan. For the British, the Conservatives were ousted in the midst of the conference. Therefore, the beloved British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was not present. In the end, the leaders decided on the Potsdam Declaration, where they planned the Japanese surrender ultimatum, which was designed to push Japan towards surrender while keeping the nation intact and have the ability to build a democracy. The conferees at Potsdam also agreed on an orderly and humane transfer to the German population from Poland, which...
Okay, that's enough of that. I'm take it over now. So, the conferees at Potsdam also agreed on an orderly and humane transfer of the German population from Poland, which eventually did occur, as around 2 million Germans died in the forced reparations and exodus that followed. The Yalta Conference was the last meeting of the Big Three, which included Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin in February 1945. At this conference in Yalta in the Soviet Union, the three leaders met to discuss possible solutions involving the organization of the UN, talk of free elections in Eastern Europe, and involvement in the war with Japan. At first, most decisions and arguments were kept a secret, and so the conference became controversial when the US and the USSR broke apart in the Cold War, as Americans believed that Roosevelt had made decisions that favored the USSR too much. No agreement on war reparations was ever reached during the Yalta Conference, but Russia eventually took about $20 billion from their zone of Germany. The Allies also reached an agreement on the 3 Ds: democratization, denazification, and demilitarization for Germany. The agreement allowed German leaders to be punished as war criminals and Germany's resources to be used to repair damages that had been inflicted in the war on other nations, which led to Germany's industrial production being at level no higher than the average of Europe as a whole. Also, to prevent Germany from becoming too powerful again, it was split into 4 zones of occupation, which had a main division between Communist East Germany, which was 1/3 of Germany, and the Democratic West Germany, which was 2/3 of the original nation. To see more on how Germany was divided, let's go to the thought bubble. Despite the fact that Berlin was deeply within Soviet-controlled Eastern Germany, the city was still divided into 4 zones of occupation, which were controlled by Great Britain, the US, the French, and of course, the USSR.
The division of Berlin mirrored the division of Germany almost exactly. However, it was in a much more concentrated area, where before the division between the free market capitalism and strict socialism spread the entire country. Now the 2 economic zones could be found within a 344 square mile city. In addition to the differences in economics within the city, there was also a great disparity between the quality of life.
Life under Stalinist communism Germany was not good, with poverty and oppression rampant.
People desperately wished to live in the democratic West Berlin and ultimately migrate from West Berlin and into Western Europe.
A large amount of these people who fled West Berlin were intellectuals, such as engineers, professors, and economists. This mass exodus is now popularly known as the brain drain.
This significantly contributed to the Soviet Union's economic struggles, as the economists and businessmen who were needed to solve economic issues were no longer present.
Foreseeing the great economic crash that was to come, the USSR employed several methods, stalling the outpour of these individuals. The USSR even performed a mass blockade of East Berlin, blocking food and resources from entering the city.
However, the blockade failed because of the Berlin airlift, where the US, France, and Great Britain sent thousands of planes every day with supplies to Berlin. It is even said that during the peak of the Berlin airlift, a plane was either landing or flying off from East Berlin every 30 seconds.
Unfortunately, the USSR was able to devise a new and more effective means of preventing people from rushing out of East Berlin, the Berlin Wall. Structured like a fortress, with guard towers, obstacles, guard dogs, and constant surveillance, the wall was extremely successful at keeping East Germans inside the Soviet zone.
Through the Berlin Wall, one can easily see the tensions that arose between the powers in the world post-World War II, and the different methods that these powers used to fix their problems.
The construction of the Berlin Wall sparked fierce political debate around the globe. U.S. President John F. Kennedy visited Berlin, and he was met with great enthusiasm by East Berliners. He delivered his now infamous speech, saying,
"There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't. What is the great issue between the free world and the communist world? Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. And there are some who say in Europe and elsewhere, we can work with the communists. Let them come to Berlin. And there are even a few who say that it is true that communism is an evil system, but it permits us to make economic progress. Laissez nach Berlin kommen. Let them come to Berlin."
Mr. Wren, wasn't it just Russia that caused the entire Cold War? And I'm back. Unlike Russia after their economic crisis. And no, my naive little self, it wasn't just Russia. However, you do raise a good point. The Soviet Union did play a big role in the culmination of the Cold War. Will you look at that? It's time for the open letter. An open letter to the people of East Berlin. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment. Oh, would you look at that? A college diploma. None of those in East Germany. They all left. Dear educated people of East Germany, why'd you leave? We needed your brains to rebuild the Soviet Union's economy. Sure, Stalin's purges and restrictive lifestyle wasn't perfect, but couldn't you have just taken one for the team? You left the dummies to die. Best wishes, Ren McLean. Ultimately, all of these conferences and conflicts stemmed from one basic battle, the battle between communism and democracy. The goals of Germany and Japan had been to stop the spread of communism and contain the United States. But ironically, after the war, communism was at an all-time high, poised to take over several countries' governments and gaining popularity. The US became a major world power. Out of World War II emerged a bipolar world. For most countries, times after war are filled with high-stress negotiations and strained relationships, unless you are, wait for it, the Mongols, who enjoyed several centuries of peace, known as Pax Mongolia, after the conquest of the majority of Asia. The US and the USSR became the main political powers. However, they were polar opposites in terms of their governments. The US with a democratic government and the USSR with a communist one. Many world leaders and world critics took up the blame game. Harry S. Truman, Winston Churchill, and Clark Clifford strongly blamed the Soviet Union's aggressive policy and inability for change. Stalin placed the blame at increasingly close British and US relations and their refusal to recognize the Soviet Union's security fears. International critics Henry Wallace and Walter Lippmann blamed both powers for neglecting opportunities for peaceful solutions. Truman had an extremely aggressive foreign policy, and his views on how the US should conduct itself during the post-war negotiations. It was true, man, that his ideas were unnegotiable, leading to tension and conflict. Truman remarked on the hard struggle ahead of the Allies in creating a new form of international peace in the wake of World War II, when he said, "Building a peace requires as much moral stamina as waging a war. Perhaps it requires even more, because it is so laborious and painstaking and undramatic. It requires undying patience and continuous application. But it can give us, if we stay with it, the greatest reward that there is in the whole field of human effort." The question became, which government system was better? With divided borders, Eastern Europe leaned towards communism, while Western Europe went for democracy. Because of Stalin's purges and the economic instability of the USSR, people wanted to live in Western Europe with democracy. Communism wasn't as successful compared to the democracy, which promised new freedoms and prosperity to the people of poverty in the East. Ultimately, the culmination of all these conflicts led to a tense 4 decades known as the Cold War. Crash Course is produced by Caroline Conway, Emily Lee, and myself. Our show is edited by Emily Lee with research conducted by Caroline, Emily, and myself. Our script is written by Caroline, Emily, and myself. Mr. Wren! Mr. Wren!